What's up everyone, Alex here. So if you're here, that means you're curious about what I think of Trails Through Daybreak 2 because I got to play it early. By the way, shoutouts to NIS America for providing this PS5 game code. But before we actually dive into the review proper, I just want to quickly reflect on how fast we got this game because nobody expected that we were going to get Trails Through Daybreak 2 within a year of the previous game's release. It wasn't too long ago when we'd have to wait up to 2 years until we finally got the next game in the Trails series. And I say next game because at the rate the games were being released in Japan, we were continuously getting further and further behind in the series. Trails Through Daybreak 2 marks a huge departure from how Falcom treats its localizations, now involving their partners much earlier in the development process, allowing this game to release less than a year after its predecessor. Because of this change, I was actually inspired to take a different approach for this review. As a direct sequel, I'm going to assume that you've at least played partway through the first game. This allows me to skip talking about things like how the hybrid combat system works. I'm also doing this because I want to discourage any thought that Trails Through Daybreak 2 would be the perfect introduction to the series, as it is a direct sequel, and many of the characters that are featured here have been deeply developed in the previous game. That said, this video will talk about two big main points: the changes to its gameplay and how that coalesces with the rest of its foundational systems, and whether or not you'll like its potentially divisive storytelling. And as always, you don't have to worry about spoilers here. In order for us to talk about the changes to its gameplay, I have to bring up the biggest complaint I had with the first game, which was its turn order display. Because this display was designed so that party member and enemy icons came from two different directions, eventually arriving at the middle to take their respective turns, this timeline made for an unnecessarily ambiguous readout, rendering it almost completely useless. This is all to say that Falcom's gotten some sense back and created a timeline that is much more readable, though they still can't resist trying to make it display in a fancy way. Sometimes, when you achieve perfection, it's just best not to tamper with it, Falcom. Of course, this isn't the only big change to the game's command battles. For starters, you now have the ability to use dual arts, which lets you combine two different elements into one powerful arts. S-Boost Generation also feels like it fills up much faster compared to the previous game. EX Chains are special SELM attacks that let you damage nearby foes after fulfilling certain requirements. And this isn't really a gameplay change, but the character portrait cut-ins that used to show up during S-Crafts in prior games make a return here. While I greatly appreciate the addition and return of some of our favorite command battle features, much like in the previous game, I found myself dabbling in field battles a lot more. I get that the original design intent for field battles is to add a bit more spice to gaining an advantage when you finally switch to command battles, but I felt that its action combat could use a few more features. Thankfully, Falcom recognized this and added the ability to cast Quick Arts, which you can invoke simply by holding down a button. Once casted, the Quick Arts will go on a cooldown, which then can be sped up by attacking enemies with your regular attacks. Additionally, performing perfect dodges are now further incentivized by allowing you to switch to a different party member to unleash a charged attack with the press of a button. The changes to Trails Through Daybreak 2's field and command battles tell me that Falcom is now comfortable working with and tweaking its overall design to make it more fun and interesting. Not a dig on the original, but while the concept of an RPG with both action and turn-based combat was executed thoughtfully and quite well, it felt that they could have done more to really sell us on the idea that things like its action combat could be more than just a transitional element. It looks as though Falcom looked at the overall design that they've laid out in Trails Through Daybreak and was able to clearly see which aspects of it needed improving, leading to enhancements and balance changes that they've implemented in the sequel. This not only helped make the game's field battles more dynamic, fast-paced, and exciting, but also introduced a different approach to its turn-based combat that, in all honesty, made it more fun to engage with than in previous games. Separate from the combat, minigames mark a well-deserved return. There are some pretty noteworthy changes too, specifically to the fishing minigame. You no longer have to find a specific fishing spot to fish in Trails Through Daybreak 2. You just need to cast a line at almost any body of water, and you can fish right then and there. You'll also find several other minigames, including a cyber hacking minigame, and, of course, a card game to name a few. While I didn't mind that the previous game lacked minigames, seeing them implemented in the sequel made it immediately apparent just how these minigames add to the overall Trails gameplay experience. And while members of our community didn't really lament too much about its suspicious absence in the previous game, I can now empathize with those who missed it. And thankfully, this only allowed Falcom to make Trails Through Daybreak 2's minigames better than they ever have been before. That said, there are some strange additions that could stand to be improved, like the tailing missions that have you following people across town, or the different activities you'll need to do to raise your relationship with each character. But I found that they weren't big enough of a deal that they detracted from my experience. Overall, there wasn't a doubt in my mind that Trails Through Daybreak 2's gameplay offerings were going to surpass the first game. If anything, the thought that Trails Through Daybreak 2's combat was going to have everything we love from the original, but way better, is enough incentive for any Trails fan to continue the journey with Van and friends. This then leads us to the story, which is probably the most divisive part of the game. As a Trails fan, you're probably used to the interconnected politicking mixed with fantasy and science fiction, along with the bombastic reveals and crazy twists and turns and happenings that make for a great adventure. This main dish is usually seasoned with important character moments that follow a character's growth as the story unfolds. So what if I told you that Trails Through Daybreak 2 flips this? Now, that's not to say that Trails Through Daybreak 2 doesn't contain all of those storytelling elements that I just mentioned that we all love. Rather, there is a tighter focus on the individual character moments of this game rather than the nuances of its main narrative. And I want to be careful when saying this next part. There also seems to be a ton of unanswered questions that are introduced towards the end of Trails Through Daybreak 2 that rob its closing moments from any satisfying climax. This, of course, stands in stark contrast to the previous game, which cleanly resolves the conflict introduced in its story in a manner that is conclusive. So if you somehow thought that Trails Through Daybreak 2 was going to conclusively close this arc, you might want to scale back your expectations. That being said, I'm a sucker for a game that develops its cast well, and Trails Through Daybreak 2 delivers on that regard. The reason why this is executed so well is because the game borrows a storytelling mechanic from Trails Through Reverie that lets you choose which group of characters you wish to follow as they splinter off into their own branches in the game's timeline. These branches can sometimes run into dead ends, which are cleverly incorporated into the story, though this usually means that scenes you've seen before will be replayed again. Despite that, the very first dead ends you encounter will certainly surprise you, and slowly brings you closer to the main cast and empathize with them more as a result. But more than that, breaking up the main cast into smaller chunks, by the way, Daybreak 2's cast is huge, allows the narrative to highlight each individual better, which is something that they learned from making Reverie. This then presents an interesting conundrum. With the vast improvements in its gameplay and a story that flips the script of what you'd expect from a Trails game, how does it fare overall? For me, the novelty of the hybrid combat styles introduction in the first game was my initial hook to this new Trails arc, and as I played through Trails Through Daybreak, I slowly fell in love with the rest of the cast. In that sense, Trails Through Daybreak 2 merely reinforces the many things that I loved about the original game, with better gameplay and a decidedly more focused character development experience. And I generally had a great time with them, despite the failings of the story towards the end. But as I said in the beginning of this video, the Trails games just keep arriving in Western shores faster than they have been. And while this game leaves a lot more questions unanswered, I'm just hoping that its follow-up arrives even sooner so we can close the books on these once and for all. Either way you slice it, Daybreak 2 is more of what I love, and that's rarely a bad thing.